Hello, I'm Dr. Kurt Buhring, and I am Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And the title of my presentation is Day and Niebuhr, Responses to the Great Depression. The Great Depression necessitated and fostered a host of economic, political, and cultural responses. While these have been studied and commented upon rather extensively, less has been explored in terms of theological and ethical responses. This presentation will examine the religious responses of two significant Christians of the period, Dorothy Day and Reinhold Niebuhr. Some evangelical Christians saw the Great Depression as God's judgment of American sinfulness and hedonism. From this perspective, an individualistic focus on spiritual matters was called for. In contrast, other Christians believed the root of the problem would not be found in individuals, but rather in the injustices of the capitalist system itself. Early in their lives, both Dorothy Day and Reinhold Niebuhr called for a radical restructuring of economic and political systems in response to the Great Depression. It's important to point out here that both Day and Niebuhr came to their early passion for social justice through lived experience and encounters with poverty and injustices in the world. Their views were based on observations and experiences of how real people were affected by the Depression. Day took on a life of voluntary poverty at a young age, and Niebuhr served as a pastor in Detroit with a working-class congregation. Though similar in their early radical calls for social justice and strong critiques of capitalism, Day and Niebuhr would move in differing directions as the 1930s went on. Day would reconcile her yearning for justice with a fuller sense of charity and a personalist approach that emphasized care, love, and the works of mercy, not federal programs, as a solution to poverty. In distinction, Niebuhr came to accept reform rather than revolution, and recognized Roosevelt's New Deal as at least moving toward a measure of justice. It is suggested here that the basis of their differing views can be found in their ideas of human nature and in their advocacy of distinct ideals. While Day crafted an ethic of care, Niebuhr called for an ethic of justice. The presentation will first consider Day and Niebuhr's early positions, then explore each thinker's more mature perspectives during the Depression and beyond. Like Niebuhr, from an early age, Day was frustrated with social injustices such as poverty. In the long loneliness, she remembered, quote, "I felt even at 15 that God meant man to be happy, that he meant to provide him with what he needed to maintain life in order to be happy, and that we did not need to have quite so much destitution and misery as I saw all around and read of in the daily press." At the time, Day asserted, religion would not provide any satisfactory answers. In fact, she referred to religion as a drug and as an impediment to her social justice yearnings. Though imperfect to her, the many leftist political movements of the time, such as socialism, appealed to Day. She believed these organizations were at least doing something in the face of social injustice. Further, she saw such groups as actively seeking to get at the root of injustices rather than dealing only with the symptoms. From this perspective, Day held a very low view of mere charity. She explained, quote, "Our hearts burned with a desire for justice and were revolted at the idea of a doled-out charity. The word charity had become something to gag over, something to shudder at." Previewing her later shift, though, she added, "The true meaning of the word we did not know." At this point, Day criticized the charitable efforts of the churches, both because she believed them to be ineffective and resented by the poor. However, despite the appeal of the various politically active social justice-oriented movements of the period, Day was still left yearning for something more, something greater. Eventually, she came to convert to Catholicism in December 1927. Even after her conversion, though, she felt she had betrayed the poor of the world, the masses. She wrote, "I was just as much against capitalism and imperialism as ever, and here I was going over to the opposition, because of course the church was lined up with property, with the wealthy, with the state, with capitalism." So, despite her conversion, there was still something missing. As reflected in her letters in the period between her conversion to Catholicism and her later work with Peter Morin, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, Day's reaction to the stock market crash in the early days of the Depression was somewhat surprisingly largely concerned with her own well-being. Working as a screenwriter in California and later living in Florida with her mother, Day wrote of her anxiety over her own financial situation. Eventually, Day returned to New York in April 1932. Around this time, Day turned her attention to the plight of the poor more fully. For example, on an assignment to Washington, D.C. for Commonweal in the fall of 1932, she covered the hunger march of the unemployed. She searched for a path of action that would bring her commitment to the poor together with her nascent religious identity. She explained, "How I long to make a synthesis reconciling body and soul, this world and the next." This is where her partnership with Peter Morin enters the picture. Just as Day's views would develop over time, Niebuhr's thinking shows shifts and growth. As mentioned, Niebuhr worked as a pastor in Detroit from 1915 to 1928. While there, he came to understand something of the social and economic realities that working class people encountered, and began to develop a kind of preferential option for the poor. Niebuhr asked, "Who is better to understand the true character of a civilization than those who suffer most from its limitations? Who will have more creative vigor in destroying the old and building the new than those whose lives, hunger, vengeance, and holy dreams have compounded a tempestuous passion?" He took wealthy titans of industry such as Henry Ford to task for unjust treatment of workers. In 1926, Niebuhr indicted the power and greed within American industry and called out Christian churches for focusing on personal moral issues and ignoring efforts to establish more Christian standards in industrial enterprise. In 1927, he criticized the ethical impotence of the modern church in its failure to deal with the evils and ethical problems of stock manipulation. Unlike other liberal thinkers, Niebuhr asserted that our reason is tainted by self-interest that we refuse to recognize. At this stage of his life, Niebuhr saw this flaw especially among the higher socioeconomic classes. Niebuhr's, quote, process of change away from liberalism was accelerated by the Great Depression. Though initially similar to other liberal thinkers and social gospel advocates, Niebuhr came to be highly critical of such views. In this period, he said, liberals tended to believe in the developing goodness and rationality of people, in the growing health of democratic and economic institutions, and in the certainty of a better and better tomorrow. Thus they downplayed the persistence of selfishness, irrationality, and brutality. Niebuhr recognized these forms of evil in the historical realities and events of his day, including especially World War I and economic, social, and political injustices. In his well-known Moral Man and Immoral Society, published in 1932, Niebuhr wielded a Marxist hammer to shatter liberal views of history as ever progressing, and liberal illusions regarding the efficacy of reason and love in social relations. Niebuhr explained, "In every group there is less reason to guide and to check impulse, less capacity for self-transcendence, less ability to comprehend the needs of others, and therefore more unrestrained egoism than the individuals who compose the group reveal in their personal relationships." For Niebuhr, the ethic of Jesus is personal, not social. Further, modern industrialization had led to a concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, the overproduction of goods, and the breakdown of the capitalist economy. In 1933, Niebuhr announced that capitalism was dying and that, quote, "it ought to die, because it is unable to make the wealth created by modern technology available to all who participate in the productive process on terms of justice." The sickness of capitalism, Niebuhr said, was organic and constitutional. It was rooted in the very nature of capitalism, in the private ownership of the productive processes. There was no middle way. Though Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to apply political power to economic inequalities, it would never be sufficient. In modern industrialized society, economic powers had conquered and transcended political powers. Liberal reforms that left economic power in the hands of the wealthy failed to address the root of the problem. The crisis could only be resolved by the socialization of industry, he said. Though it was an ideal that could never be fully achieved, Niebuhr advocated the Marxist vision of justice, quote, "which is as impossible of consistent application in the complexities of society as the Christian ideal of love. But it is an ideal toward which a rational society must move." Throughout the 1920s and 30s then, Niebuhr indicted capitalism, called out the greed and self-interest of the wealthy, and advocated for a socialist restructuring of America. Thus, early in their lives, Niebuhr and Day each asserted that only radical, systemic changes to the economic and political structures could be the effective way to address the Great Depression. Day would maintain that radical change was needed, but her focus moved from structures to people after she met Peter Morin. She wrote of her encounter with Peter Morin as a great turning point in her life. Together, Day and Morin would found the Catholic worker movement in 1933. They explained, "When asked what is the program of the Catholic worker by those interested in political action, legislation, lobbying, class war, we reply, it is the program set forth by Christ in the Gospels." According to Day's understanding of the life of Jesus, resistance to capitalism did not entail a revolutionary overthrow of the system. Instead, the life of Jesus exemplified living with and as the poor, rather than an overt challenge to the powers that be. Morin envisioned, quote, working from the bottom and with a few. In a letter from 1935, Day wrote, "The great work which is to be done is to change public opinion, to indoctrinate, to set small groups to work here and there in different cities who will live a life of sacrifice, typifying the Catholic idea of personal responsibility. Numbers and organizations are not important," she continued. "But one person can do a tremendous amount of boring from within, in his office, factory, neighborhood, parish, and among his daily acquaintances and associates." Day and Morin looked to emulate the message and method of Jesus. As a way to address some of the problems, economic and spiritual, of the Depression, Day and Morin crafted their program of action. This program consisted of houses of hospitality, farming communes or agronomic universities, roundtable discussions, and a newspaper that would popularize the program for, in their words, the man in the street. Here, the focus will be on the houses and the farms, both of which stress community and charity, and not the mere charity Day had criticized earlier. The houses of hospitality were inspired by Day's view of Jesus. The worker saw the immediate remedy to poverty as performing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Day and Morin were concerned about the material well-being of others, specifically the poor, the marginalized, and the outcast, because Jesus was. Jesus committed his life to living among, and more importantly today, as the poor. To Day and Morin, voluntary poverty acted as a, quote, liberating force that would free one to perform the works of mercy. Only then can one truly give of oneself to others. Day asserted, quote, "We must have a sense of personal responsibility to take care of our own and our neighbor at a personal sacrifice. Charity is personal. Charity is love." In contrast to her earlier emphasis on an abstract notion of structural justice, she now argued it is the people who are important, not the masses. It was the people as individuals, unique individuals with unique needs, who were being served. This personalist approach, which stressed charity and responsibility, was also intertwined with an anarchist philosophy. Day was critical of what she referred to as Holy Mother the State, taking responsibility for the poor, and wanted, quote, none of the state relief of the New Deal programs. Though also in part an expression of pacifism, Day's anarchism was less a negative critique of government and more an advocacy for personal expressions of care for one another. She recognized our responsibility to others, saying, "We are our brother's keeper, not the state." In addition, the government might be able to address material needs, but this was not the entirety of the problem. She writes, "Men are not merely mouths to be fed and bodies to be sheltered, but are creatures of body and soul, and we maintain that it belongs first to the Church to care for them, and that only in times of national emergency should the state bear so gigantic a burden as it is doing today." Only a personalist response to the Depression could meet the holistic needs of those suffering. The Catholic workers' anarchist philosophy and advocacy of personal responsibility culminated in the long-range program of agronomic universities or farming communes. In the farms, Peter Morin saw solutions to, quote, unemployment, delinquency, destitute, old age, man's rootlessness, lack of room for growing families, and hunger. While Day was concerned with labor issues, Peter saw these as patching up the system instead of trying to rebuild society itself, which was a goal of the farming communes. In his vision, scholars and workers would learn from each other, guided by Morin's philosophy of work as an exchange of gifts, rather than for a wage. The farm emphasized a, quote, return to the land where there's always work, a model of self-sufficiency and a forerunner of the current small farm localist approaches. Morin's slogan was eat what you raise what you eat. Also evident in this component of the program of action was an understanding of the human as communal and as co-creator with God. For Day, community was the social answer to the long loneliness. And finally, love of God could be expressed primarily through love of individuals in community. As Day had moved from her younger demand for structural justice and systemic restructuring, Niebuhr also developed during the 1930s. Though originally critical of Roosevelt and the New Deal, is not radically enough tempering the inherent flaws of capitalism, by 1940 he grew to appreciate the positive value of steps in the right direction. A few reasons can explain Niebuhr's shift away from radical politics toward at least tepid support of the New Deal. First, Niebuhr no longer believed that socialism would be an effective political force in the United States. In fact, he resigned from the Socialist Party in 1940. Niebuhr now more strenuously applied his examinations of the ambiguities of reason and power to the working classes. He now came to see more fully the imperfections of the proletariat. Like the wealthy, the lower socioeconomic classes were corrupted by self-interest as a primary motivating force. Next, Niebuhr also became dissatisfied with bickering within labor unions, the greed and egotism of union leaders, and the ostracization of non-union workers. Finally, quote, what was decisive in Niebuhr's move from socialism toward Roosevelt was the increasingly dire threat of Nazism. In short, quote, the defense of democracy was a higher priority than social revolution. Whereas the socialists were more isolationist, Roosevelt's policies offered viable, though imperfect, responses to Hitler's ambitions and actions. Niebuhr believed that the kingdom of God could not be achieved on earth. Perfect love and perfect justice are impossibilities. However, Roosevelt's New Deal at least moved toward relative measures of justice, imperfect harmonies of justice, which are not to be taken lightly. He writes, the task of political life is to balance the forces within a community so that, on the one hand, a relative justice and peace are possible, and that, on the other hand, the dangers of tyranny and anarchy are avoided. Thus, Niebuhr came to recognize the positive and pragmatic aspects of the New Deal. Given this pragmatism, or Christian realism, Niebuhr likely would have seen the Catholic worker movement as unrealistic, though admirable, as a response to domestic poverty, and irresponsible as a response to international politics. According to Niebuhr, Christian ideals provide, quote, an absolute standard by which to criticize society, but not a foundation for a responsible ethical stance. While a Christian ideal of love may be operative among individuals, justice is the Christian ideal for larger collectives. Niebuhr believed it was hard enough to approximate justice, let alone love, quote, which demands more than justice. In order to approximate justice, collectives must be coerced toward what is ethical in this sense. He asserted, a simple Christian moralism counsels men to be unselfish. A profounder Christian faith must encourage men to create systems of justice which will save society and themselves from their own selfishness. Thus, society has the need for systems of taxation and social security. Much of the difference between Dorothy Day and Reinhold Niebuhr is rooted in their different natures of human nature and different views of human nature, which are consequently manifested in differing emphases for ethics. For Day, care; for Niebuhr, justice. Though she clearly was aware of human sinfulness and depravity, Day importantly emphasized that we're capable of goodness. She admitted, quote, I can well recognize the fact that people remaining as they are, Peter's program is impossible. But it would become actual, given a people changed in heart and mind, so that they would observe the new commandment of love, or desired to. Coupled with a positive appraisal of the potential for goodness in us all, throughout her life, Day developed an ethic of care. June O'Connor asserts, quote, Day's appeal to others to share her vision was not cast in terms of justice and rights, as much as it was cast in terms of dignity, respect, and love for the brother and sister whose keeper she believed she was. End quote. In addition to differing theological anthropologies, then, O'Connor's distinction between an ethic of care and an ethic of justice is a valuable way to contrast Day with Niebuhr. In 1927, Niebuhr offered that, quote, human nature is an intriguing amalgam of potential virtue and inchoate vice, in proportions sufficiently variable to prompt both trust and fear. For Niebuhr, many Christians, especially Catholics, think of human nature too optimistically, while also avoiding the other extreme, evident within what he referred to as a Protestant theory of total depravity. Niebuhr called for a middle ground, a biblical view of humanity that would more realistically stake out this gray area. We are sinful, full of pride and self-interest. However, we're also created in the image of God and redeemed by Jesus. Niebuhr, too, would grant that we're capable of greatness, and as a result of being redeemed in Jesus Christ. While we maintain this potential, however, we often fall short, according to Niebuhr. Niebuhr serves as a reminder of the limitations of ourselves and our world, yet also the importance of our possibilities, imperfect though they may be. He writes, the social ideal of Jesus is as perfect and as impossible of attainment as is his personal ideal. But again, it is an ideal that cannot be renounced completely. It's because of our redemption in Jesus Christ that this ideal remains vitally important. In 1939, Niebuhr asserted, quote, truth is always partly corrupted by power and interest, but it's in the margin of purity where truth transcends interest partially that civilization is built and men maintain a sane world, where there's some hope of adjusting interest to interest, life to life, and value to value. This margin of purity where truth transcends partially may offer only a sliver of hope, but it is nevertheless the basis of Niebuhr's response to the Depression. Day and Niebuhr held very similar views early in their lives. Both of them critiqued the injustices they saw as inherent in capitalism and worked to be in solidarity with the poor. As their thought developed, Day and Niebuhr diverged. Whereas Day shifted toward calls for a personalist ethic of care and love based on the life of Jesus, Niebuhr came to recognize the value of reform as at least approximating an ethic of justice, even though imperfect. Though differing in their theological anthropologies and approaches to the Great Depression, both Day and Niebuhr serve as figures who personified our immense capacity to strive toward love and justice. I appreciate your attention to the presentation, and I would welcome any questions that you might have at my email address, which is kbuhring@stmarys.edu. Thank you for your time.